Sponsor of the SKOR North Studios. TCL, America's fastest growing TV brand. It's Purple Daily.
All right, welcome into Purple Daily. Matthew Coller here, along with Andrew Krammer, Vikings beat reporter from the Star Tribune, filling in Courtney Cronin's shoes today. Andrew, how are you?
Big shoes to fill. Good to be on.
You are back in the studio. You remember this weirdly shaped table. You remember how to use the microphone a little bit.
I do. The nostalgia's coming back.
You know, good. All the great moments.
It's not allergies. It's a little tear in my eye.
Were there great moments?
Yep. Of course there were. Of course, with Phil. Back when Royce was still here. Absolutely.
Yeah. And there was a wide left kick that you got to cover as a member of our staff.
Every 4 years, it feels like there is. Yeah.
So your timing was really good to have you in today, because you just reported today that there is a possibility that the Minnesota Vikings could move Riley Reiff from left tackle to left guard. And I tweeted your article, and let me just say the response was not friendly to that idea. So tell me about why the Minnesota Vikings would consider moving their left tackle to left guard, because it worked out so well moving a tackle to guard last year.
Yeah, I think any idea that comes out for the Minnesota Vikings offensive line is going to be met with that kind of skepticism, and rightfully so, because nothing has really kind of come together or worked out too much other than picking Brian O'Neill in the second round. They're thinking this because they need better protection for Kirk Cousins' backside. I mean, Riley's the guy who gave up back-to-back strip sacks in weeks 3 and week 4. He was inconsistent throughout the year. He hasn't really been worth the money that they paid him on a $58 million contract. And so because of all that, Riley just turned 30 in December as well. And if you think you can find your long-term future at left tackle, why not start right now? And whether that's Brian O'Neill or somebody you can draft or get in free agency, that's the kind of thinking behind it. And Riley's going to get the short end of the stick because of how bad Mike Remmers had played this year. So I understand that that experiment might not sound great, but Riley was projected by some to be a guard when he was coming out of Iowa. He had experience playing guard at Iowa. Now he hasn't in the NFL. But this is a guy that they think can still play for them at a higher level than maybe Mike Remmers did last year.
So what would that mean for Riley Reiff's contract? I mean, would they have some leverage then to restructure him? There is the June 1st thing. I think all of his signing bonus money has been used, which means after June 1st, he could be one of those guys that they could cut. So they would have some leverage to restructure him. But at the same time, by June 1st, you've already gone through the free agent process.
Exactly. So by then you're going to know whether or not you've got the replacement for him. And I think the thinking is if you do, then you're more willing to part ways. If you don't, then you're kind of stuck with him. Then he's going to be that left tackle, at least for 2019. In terms of his contract, he's due $11 million. That's steep if you're going to play him at guard. And so I think if they get a replacement for him, they can work on a possible restructure this spring, something they've naturally done. They could look to do that with Mike Remmers as well if they don't end up cutting him. This is a situation where everything's so fluid with this offensive line because of how poorly guys played at times. And it was something where one thing went wrong every week. It wasn't always the five collectively playing poorly. And so you can't really stick to your guns on anybody outside of the young guys, Elflein and O'Neill.
Yeah, and that's something that I noticed with the New England Patriots is that their offensive line, their left tackle, they traded for Trent Brown. They traded a 3rd-round pick for him. Everyone else is drafted and developed. And when you look back at these recent drafts from the Vikings, it's sort of the same way that they handled the tight end position that they handled the offensive line for the most part. It's, well, we drafted this guy in the 4th round and he's got to be right in there playing. And that just really isn't a great model for that. And even Brian O'Neill, though he played well at right tackle, it wasn't ideal to have him play as much as he did because he is still a developmental guy. Pat Elflein, they had to throw right in too, and I think to his detriment in some ways there. And then this year he has to come back from the injury, and so he hasn't had the full development that he's needed either. And when you go back through those drafts, you've got to wonder, maybe not 1st round even, but even more 2nd round, more 3rd round guys. Dalvin Cook is a very good player, hasn't been on the field a whole lot. They decided not to draft a lineman in that draft, even though they needed one in the 2nd round, and wait till the 3rd round. And I guess there's a bunch of different times where you could question their draft approach when you see that one of the best lines in the league was developed over a number of years. In 2015, I went back and looked on Pro Football Focus. 2015, the Patriots were ranked 2nd to last in pass protection, and now they're up toward the top with kind of the same guys, except for they've just developed them and pushed them forward. So now it feels like trying to play catch up and scratching and clawing in a lot of ways, but they still don't look to me like they're going to have a very good offensive line next year, even with some other better options.
And specifically, you're right, with the offensive line in that Patriots Super Bowl, isn't that the greatest lesson in how this dynasty with the Patriots is just an example of coaching and development, as you just said, with the offensive line specifically, though. They don't spend, the Patriots don't, first rounders very often on offensive linemen, or really day two, first or second or third round guys, I should say. So with that, if the Vikings sit there and say, well, why can't we do that? Well, it's because you haven't had that consistent offensive line coach. And unfortunately, with the passing of Tony Sparano, it has to reset that for them. They have to get a new guy in there. They were really set and kind of screwed the way that happened in terms of just the football aspect of his passing. And so with all of that, they need to reset and get Rick Dennison in here, who's probably going to be the offensive line coach named either this week or next. They need to get some kind of coaching consistency going and find that development, because you don't have a Dante Scarnecchia here like the Patriots do, a longtime guy who's viewed as one of the best offensive line coaches in the NFL. They don't have that. And so you just need to try and develop the guys you do have. And you're right, maybe spend higher picks where other teams have that luxury of not having to.
So let's try to project this out. If Riley Reiff moves to left guard, the left tackle is going to be Brian O'Neill, or is it going to be whoever they draft with the 18th overall pick?
Yeah, if they feel like they can get one at 18th overall, that's where I think they're going to try and go. But at the same time, if they miss on that, I think they're open to Brian O'Neill moving spots. He played so well at that right spot. And you've seen guys in the past, Nate Solder, do that, move to the left side after starting out on the right side because he was so good as a rookie or as a young guy. So I think you could see that happen. I think they're going to keep their options open. To me, it's going to come down to, too, what kind of guards can they get in free agency? Are they going to be stuck with Mike Remmers and restructuring that contract and hoping he can improve a second year at that guard spot? If not,
all of this is so Vikings. It's just so Vikings. It's like trying to convince yourself that something that didn't work is all of a sudden going to work.
You can't get 3 new starters in one offseason. You just can't. They don't have the money to do it. They've invested so much of that money on defense, and rightfully so with how good that group has been consistently year to year. So they just don't have the money to just buy 3 new starters or the draft capital necessarily, because they're going into this draft right now with 5 draft picks.
The offensive line prospects, there are quite a few good ones at the tackle position. Jonah Williams is probably out of the Vikings range, I would say. He strikes me as a guy that's going to be top 10, although the mock drafts have been all over the place. Some people think he's going to be a guard, but I don't see that. I think if you're a legit tackle prospect, you're going in the top 10. But there's other guys. Greg Little from Ole Miss, Cody Ford from Oklahoma, Jawan Taylor from Florida are the top names. And then Dalton Risner is a guy who seemed to have his stock rise at the Senior Bowl. So there are lots of options for the Vikings on the offensive line. But when you look at Brian O'Neill and the growing pains that he went through, though I liked a lot of things that he did, it was also shaky at times from week to week. And there were some times where he was just flat out overpowered. You're probably asking a lot of a rookie tackle if you're going to put him in there, especially at the left tackle position. Khalil Mack is still going to be in this division next year. And when you look at the free agent tackles, there are no upgrades on Riley Reiff in the free agent market.
No, right now there is not. You're absolutely right. That position is becoming almost like quarterbacks, where the good ones just don't become available. They will get overpaid to stay where they're at. And keep in mind, the Vikings, Riley Reiff was their third and maybe fourth, fifth option in free agency. They missed on Andrew Whitworth. They missed on Russell Okung. They wanted to bring back Matt Khalil over him. Now, they probably got lucky that they didn't, and Carolina gave him more money, but they didn't necessarily prioritize Riley Reiff. So he kind of fell into their lap. And so where they're at with him, this is still something they're just talking about, just thinking. This isn't, decisions don't get made, obviously, January, February. So Riley Reiff could still very much be the left tackle week 1 of next season. So you're right. You're not going to find one in free agency. You got to hope that if you're the Vikings, this is a draft that kind of develops to where quarterbacks, defensive stars kind of get plucked a bunch in that top 10, and you get a talent that falls to you in that 18 spot.
Andrew Krammer sitting in Courtney Cronin's seat today here on Purple Daily. Matthew Coller with you as well. 651-646-8255. Help us fix the offensive line for the Minnesota Vikings.
We're going to do it this afternoon.
We're going to do it this afternoon here in early February, because we've got a month until teams can start actually signing players. And then we aren't even that close to the NFL Combine, Andrew. We were joking around about that yesterday. Like, okay, so we can break down the new Fast and Furious trailer, I guess. I mean, there is a long time to go before they figure these things out. So clearly you are not reporting that tomorrow Riley Reif is putting his guard shoes on and he's going to play there. But that being an option, it just sort of tells you something about signing veteran free agents. And I wrote a piece at the beginning of the offseason. Don't be so sure the Vikings are going to go out and overpay for Roger Saffold or Ramon Foster, one of the top guard names, because those guys are over 30 and it's risky to do it. And the last couple of guys that they've paid a lot for, Alex Boone, Mike Remmers, Riley Reif. Boone got cut in year 2, didn't play good in year 1. Sorry, I sounded like Zimmer there. Play good. Mike Remmers moves from right tackle to right guard and was very poor and was one of the most overpaid right guards per his production. And then now you have a left tackle that you're paying starting left tackle money who's in the conversation to move to left guard. I mean, it just tells you everything about signing free agents, unless it's an Andrew Whitworth, and those guys hardly ever come out on the market. It's usually not worth it to go all in. You have to take a patient approach. This team hasn't really done that. They panicked because of 2016 was so bad, and they signed 2 guys that weren't worth it. And then last year, they end up having some things go wrong and not drafting the guy in the first round that they should have drafted. And they end up again with a poor offensive line.
Man, wouldn't it be nice to have a Hall of Fame quarterback willing to take a little money to stay there and just kind of play into his 40s in his prime and do all the things like maybe, I don't know, a Tom Brady. It's just those kinds of advantages where you've got the salary cap space, you've got the coaching we mentioned with the offensive line coaching over there in New England being so good that you can just kind of create guys. And then like with Nate Solder, when he gets too old, just let him go. And then all of a sudden, we still win a Super Bowl without him. Those kinds of things are just amazing to me, and how those pieces fall together. And the Vikings having to pay as much as they did for Kirk Cousins, that limits their window, because they've got all these high price stars they want to pay on defense to keep them together. That's going to limit their ability. And we're seeing it right now with the offensive line.
This team has such a tendency to overreact, and make the wrong move. And I feel like that's exactly what they did in signing Reif and Remmers, even though they got a decent performance in 2017 out of the offensive line. But when you look back at the performance by Riley Reif, it starts out solid, but then here come the injuries. And this is the same thing that happened last year. And at the end of the day, Reif is a bottom third offensive tackle that you probably could have picked up with somebody else. It was watching TJ Clemmings. It was so bad watching TJ Clemmings. They needed to go out and spend all this money. And I think with this year, the number one thing they need to keep in mind is do not overreact and make a big mistake here and overpay somebody on the free agent market, or even reach in the draft. If there's one of those top tackles, then take him. But if not, then take the best guy who's going to be there, because otherwise that's how you end up with a Colton Miller, for example, who was a disaster in Oakland. They overdrafted him because he was a big athletic left tackle, but there were a lot of red flags there.
And I think the sharpest point of criticism that we can put on this Vikings offensive line situation is their inability to scout late round targets. For how much Rick Spielman wants to be that kind of Patriot-style team that just gets gems in the late rounds and finds them. They did that with John Sullivan. It worked once. Great. Congrats. It didn't work since. But a lot of those guys are not even in the league anymore. Tyrus Thompson, Jeff Baca, TJ Clemmings, you just mentioned. It's not like these guys are leaving.
Where's the beef? Is Willie Beaver still around? I think he's still around.
Chicago. I think Chicago actually just signed him last month.
I saw TJ Clemmings in an Oakland Raiders game.
But those guys
are still around too.
They're certainly not starring. So these guys, at least as they're young, are getting batted around, but they're not leaving and becoming great players. So I'm not necessarily saying it's a dearth of coaching on the Vikings. It's just their inability to scout and find those guys in the draft, as you were just talking about.
So here's another idea that I think is maybe more viable, but I don't know how they feel about it. It seems like the Vikings are locked into the idea of Pat Elflein as their long-term center. And I don't blame them for that. He has a lot of the tendencies that you really like from a personality perspective, but also I think he was in a very tough spot and not used the best by John DeFilippo. We saw Pat Shurmur get him moving all the time. That's where he was good. But he was also a really good guard in college as well. Center to guard, I think, is easier than tackle to guard. And there are better centers on the free agent market, and they don't always cost a ton. but Matt Paradis from the Denver Broncos is probably the top name. Ryan Khalil is old and beat up, but still maybe a one-year contract type of guy. There are a few names on that market of guys who are reasonably decent at center that might be the better way to go than trying to move Reef inside and drafting a tackle and just hoping that guy's NFL ready to play left tackle.
Yeah, and if you're the Vikings, I don't think you can be closed-minded about that. To your point, I don't think you can sit there and say that we're just locked in on Pat being the center. I know that was one of Kirk Cousins' biggest points of frustration this past offseason was they couldn't get Pat on the field. They couldn't. He had worked with like 4 or 5 different centers up until and then trading for Brett Jones literally 2-3 weeks before the season, whatever it was, to get a guy that would start the first 3 games at center. So to have your franchise quarterback, the guy you paid all this money to, and to undermine him with not even being able to get your center back on the field or find a consistent one, that was a part that really didn't play well with Kirk. And so with Pat, he didn't really find that groove. He didn't really find that stride this season. I don't know if it was the injury so much that was holding him back throughout the year, is just not being able to have an offseason to add the strength that he needed to add, to do the things he needed to do to take that leap from his rookie season. You saw in that Patriots game, by week 13, Bill Belichick was basically scheming up his defense to target Pat Elflein and those terrible guards that were on the field at the end of the year, both playing through injuries. Tom Compton and Mike Remmers at the time were. So they just knew that was the weakest point of that group. And so you're right. I don't think they can sit there and say we are set at the center position. I think when Rick Dennison gets in here as the O-line coach, they need to be totally wide open with where they put these guys in 2019, because nobody really played besides Brian O'Neill. Nobody really played to kind of secure their spot.
So let me ask you this. Let's just say that I fast forward you 12 months from now, 11 months from now, and we're in January of next year, and I tell you, wow, the Vikings had a good offensive line this year. Pro Football Focus rated them 10th in the league in offensive line play. Tell me how that happened.
I don't believe you.
I mean, I think there is a world in which they find a good offensive line, and that world starts with Kevin Stefanski and Gary Kubiak, for one. So the scheme would be a main part of that. But if they're going to somehow put the pieces together, what do you think would be the best combination? In the perfect world, everything goes right for them, and boom, they have a top 10 offensive line.
I think it's somehow landing a franchise left tackle at 18th overall and somehow finding a veteran guard or center who can plug right in and play right away. You put Elflein wherever you think he fits in between that group, and maybe you've got Reef at that left guard spot. And I do think Reef would play out a lot better than Mike Remmers there.
I agree.
Just in terms of where he's been in life and understand that he's played that position before. Mike Remmers looked at times like a deer in the headlights when he was playing that spot. I don't think Reef would have the same approach to it, or at least he would have that more experience to be settled in it. So I think that's probably the best shot. And to get some consistency with the coaching, get the right play calling, lean more on the running game, make their jobs easier, because they did not do that last year with how pass happy they were.
And Brian O'Neill has to put on some weight.
He really does. Yeah. In order to get to my point about running the ball more, in terms of Mike Zimmer's point too. I don't know if you've heard, Matt. Mike Zimmer wants them to run the ball more. But it really does help the offensive lineman when you don't have a talented group. And so if they're going to get the most out of it, I think it does stand to benefit them by using Dalvin Cook more. Hopefully, if you're them, he can stay healthy. But Brian O'Neill needs to add weight in order to be able to become a good run blocker, because that was by far his biggest weakness last year.
Star Tribune beat reporter Andrew Krammer for the Minnesota Vikings in here with me on Purple Daily. Matthew Coller, 651-646-8255. If I told you that next year the Vikings had a top 10 offensive line, how would it happen? What is your offseason plan for the Vikings to fix the line? I can envision Vikings fans right now soaking in the O-line talk. Like they wanted this so bad. Bring me the offensive line talk. Because every time, maybe you've noticed this from my Twitter, every time I tweet about anything other than that, like, hey, Chad Beebe's got a good chance next year. Not if he doesn't have an offensive line. Like, thanks, everyone. Thanks. I know I did notice that the last couple of years. So feel free to chime in on the future of the Vikings offensive line, 651-646-8255. When we come back, I want to ask Andrew the most interesting interesting off-season team in the NFL. Offense may be a part of that as well. I want to take a look at some cap space to see which teams could do the most spending in the NFC. We will talk about that next. Andrew Krammer from the Star Tribune, Matthew Coller will be right back on Purple Daily.
It's Phil Mackey here from the all-new SKOR North on 1500 and SKORNorth.com. We've made it easier than ever to find our team-centric Minnesota sports podcast. Wherever you subscribe to podcasts, just search SKOR North, that's SKOR, and you'll find SKOR North Vikings, for instance, which includes Purple Daily, Purple Podcast, and Vikings Ventline. SKOR North Wolves includes Raised by Wolves, Myron Medcalf on Hoops, and more. SKOR North Twins includes Touch 'em All, Royce on Baseball, and more, and so on. Just search SKOR North, SKOR, wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
You aren't into Minnesota sports? Talk to the Mitten. SKOR North. Minnesota sports. Anytime, anywhere. SKORNorth.com.
And this portion of Purple Daily is brought to you by Fratelloni's Ace Hardware and Garden Stores, proud sponsors of the Beer Show, heard Thursday nights right here on SKOR North on 1500.
All right, back here on Purple Daily in hour number 2, ESPN's Bill Barnwell will join us at 1:30. Also, Manny has his list of 8 or 9 things. That's the thing. It's either 8 or 9.
Is that the official title?
Yeah, it is Manny's list of 8 or 9
yep.
things.
I like that.
Because I asked him to make a top 10 list one time, and he was like, well, I have 8 or 9. I was like, is it 8 or is it 9?
And then, Krammer, last week I actually made a list of 10, my 10 favorite Super Bowls ever, and I had to cut one.
Yeah.
Yes. I was ordered by Coller to cut one.
Somebody's holding you accountable. I like that.
You got to stay true to the bit. It is 8 or 9. 651-646-8255 to jump on. Fixing the offensive line, the topic you were all waiting for. I waited till the Super Bowl was over and a team with a good offensive line won.
Nobody's talking about this
finally
either.
go offensive line, go all in. We won't talk about that for the entire hour, but if you've got more ideas to fix the Vikings offensive line, feel free to chime in. We'll start with Doug in Lakeville here. How are you, Doug?
Hey, I'm good. Offensive line talk. I love it.
I know, man. It's great.
Two questions, one of which you may have answered. How did the Colts turn their offensive line around so quickly? And then the second question is, thinking of the draft instead of free agents, how many, starting quality, plug the guy in for 8 to 10 years, offensive linemen are there in the draft And would a realistic strategy be to get two of them, either one at 18 and then trade some draft picks, move up so that we would come out of the draft with two really superior offensive linemen? Those are my questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate the call. I will answer the first one. You can answer the second one, Andrew. First one is Quentin Nelson was a 6th overall pick. If a guard is taken 6th overall, he is a freak, and he was a freak, and he did something that almost never happens, a guy stepping in and just dominating right away.
Yeah, you have to be convinced you're drafting a future Hall of Famer to take a guy at 6 overall at guard, and I think they might have.
They also were not afraid to do what Doug just suggested, which is draft 2 offensive linemen. They took a guy from Auburn that I thought the Vikings might have taken if he was there, which is Braden Smith. Turned out to be a really good player. They had drafted Ryan Kelly. Are you getting a sense for the theme here?
And he was injured the year before and came back this year.
Yes,
so that
was a huge improvement
Yep.
for them. And then Mark Glowinski, I believe, was a draft pick of theirs as well, and he's a pretty good player. And then Anthony Costanzo's been a good player for quite a while. So really it was draft, and that's the only way to really do it, I think. And then plus scheme. Scheme is a big part of this too. They were under Pagano making Andrew Luck drop back 7-step, 9-step drops, and that was kind of the old school way he was doing it, throwing it down the field more often, where Frank Reich got the ball out quickly with Andrew Luck this year. All that played into it. But I think the theme from Indy is pretty clear. And I don't think anybody would be upset if the Vikings drafted 2 offensive linemen with their first 2 picks.
Yeah, that would be a departure a little bit from how they're trying to do things, how Rick Spielman tries to accumulate picks. You've heard everything about that. They should get at least a couple, I believe, 6th-round compensatory picks that should up their total draft stock to 7 currently. Usually, as you know, I don't know if you've heard, Rick likes to have 10 picks. That's the mantra we hear every single year. So
I've heard that.
If they are to acquire that many more, it's going to be hard to draft up more and send out more to get up back into the first round. Now, we have seen them do that, though, instances like 2013, 2014, when they jump back in for Cordero Patterson, jump back in for Teddy Bridgewater. When they've got a guy that they really like, they are not afraid to jump up there and do it.
Mm-hmm.
However, they had more draft capital then than they do now. And so I wonder if you do that, if Rick Spielman decides to jump back into the first round all the way at the end of April here a few months out, that would be a clear message of even more message that they're so all in on the current group that they've got, because those draft picks are so coveted in terms of the long-term future of this team.
You are listening to Purple Daily. Andrew Krammer, beat reporter for the Vikings for the Star Tribune, is with us. Let's go to Roger in Cottage Grove. What's up, Roger?
Hey, guys. I was just wondering what your thoughts were about Nick Easton and what his impact in coming back to the Vikings after his injury. And I know you've talked about Pat Elflein quite a bit as well, but how injured he was and how that really hurt the overall offensive line. So those are kind of my thoughts. I'm hoping that they go high in the draft and get either a guard or a tackle. But I'd like the idea of trying to pick up a center and maybe moving Elflein over. But, there's a lot of possibilities. But I think having 2 guys from the center of the line hurt, both Easton and Elflein, really had a big impact. And we had to rely on kind of secondary guys like Remmers, et cetera.
Thanks, Roger. Appreciate the call.
Yeah, I think if you're looking for parallels, like the previous caller to the Colts, one would be you're hoping Pat Elflein in full healthy offseason, he can come back and make the kind of impact that Ryan Kelly made for the Colts.
Mm-hmm.
He has the potential to do that, whether it's at center or at guard. I think that's probably going to be, because you're right, that was such a big issue for them this year, not being on the same page with Kirk Cousins, bad snaps throughout the year, not playing up to the level that he had played as a rookie. So that's going to be a big one, I think.
Now, when you look at the possibilities, can I just select all? So Nick Easton is a free agent. He's not going to cost a lot to bring back because he's coming off of a pretty serious injury that kept him out for the full season. We're not even really sure about his football future, but if he's back in playing shape, you can bring him back. You can draft 2 offensive linemen in the first 2 rounds if you want to. I don't think there's any limit to the number of bodies that you can bring in here to try to make this work. Because if it were Case Keenum was still the quarterback, or somebody who had mobility and pocket presence and playmaking ability, you would say, okay, well, that's fine. You can maybe skimp a little or leave Riley Reif over there. He'll be just good enough. but not with this quarterback. And when you watched Jared Goff in the Super Bowl, the hesitation that was there, the pressure that brought on, we saw that on a weekly basis from Kirk Cousins. And when Riley Reif had a matchup that he couldn't handle, it was just over. And Jerry Hughes was the great example of that against Buffalo. He dominated Riley Reif, and Kirk Cousins did not know how to adapt, and it just took apart the entire game plan. In this case, they have to build it up as much as possible, as many assets as it takes, really, to protect him, because that's one of his major shortcomings.
Yeah, Nick Easton's one we haven't talked about, probably because of the uncertainty, as you had mentioned. We really don't know, coming off a bulging disc in his neck surgery, a big offensive lineman like that. You've seen, now John Sullivan made the comeback off of a couple back surgeries. You can't sit there and bank on it, though. I know Nick is younger. That at least lends credence to the idea that he can come back from that. But if he's dealing with, for instance, nerve issues or any kind of things that can come from that type of injury, you need to be really careful. One, not to bank on him, certainly, not to pay him a lot of money and not to think that he's going to be your option. But two, wondering how he can hold up long-term throughout the course of a season, even if he wins the job in training camp. So with Nick Easton, that's a backseat option to me. That's not somebody you can even bank on right now. I need to see him just play football again to even think that he can be your option there.
Do I dare move off of the offensive line topic?
I didn't know there was any other positions on the field.
I know. It's amazing. Did you know that the quarterback can make a throw when he's pressured?
I didn't, actually.
Or that,
not since the Eagles game I did.
Or he can get the ball out in under 3 seconds. Like, you're allowed to do that. There's a great, by the way, speaking of that, Snark, there's a great Pro Football Focus stat about the expected points added while scrambling and the big time throws made while scrambling. So Pat Mahomes is like through the roof in both categories. The number of big time throws made by Kirk Cousins when scrambling, you got to guess?
A couple?
It's 0.
Okay.
They tracked him having 0 big time throws when scrambling.
Wow.
Which means into tight coverage, into a tight window.
I would have thought it would have been at least 1 or 2. That's pretty impressive.
And turnover worthy plays were pretty high. You remember the play in Detroit where he was rolling out and just threw it to nobody and it was almost picked off.
Yeah.
And this is the bigger point about the offensive line and needing to build it up.
Yeah, and even when he was protected at times, you saw him make bad throws when he was getting pressured earlier in games and getting kind of seeing ghosts, as they would say, kind of shook by the pressure that he had gotten before. And it really fell off to me after that Philadelphia game in Week 5. He was making throws. Remember, after that game, he had made some comment like, I had to see between legs and ankles to see if my passes were being completed. And that was an underhanded shot at the offensive line. At least I know
forgot about that one.
At least I know that's how the offensive lineman took it. And so ever since then, you didn't see Kirk play under pressure the same way. He wasn't the same guy. He didn't have that consistency. And I don't know if it was playing hurt. I don't know if he had just taken too many hits in the first half of the season. But Kirk showed that he couldn't hold up the full season like that. And unless you're going to get him on the move, he must be a really bad thrower on the move in practice if they didn't get him out more. I was impressed more with what the Lions tried to do with Matthew Stafford in the second game, getting him away from that Vikings pass rush because of how badly he was beaten in that first matchup.
Yeah.
I was more impressed with that coaching than what we saw from Kevin Stefanski in that second game against the Lions.
Well, that leads us to exactly something I wanted to ask you about, is the presence of Gary Kubiak is pretty interesting here, that he is going to be assistant coach / offensive advisor. And it seems to me like that means Kevin Stefanski wants to run a Shanahan-style, Gary Kubiak type of offense. And a big part of that is getting Kirk Cousins on the move in the bootlegs, which I think he can do. He is terrific in the boots.
He is. That's what I hear. Yeah.
As Purple Podcast listeners would know, because we have obsessed over how terrific he is in the boots. But I think that it was all of the factors combined with the offensive line, that the sum of the talent that was there was not what the result was. Like, the individuals put together, the performance was well below what they should have been able to do, even though it would have never been great. It didn't have to be like the worst in the league. And it was, or one of the worst.
You're right, because we saw what Pat Shurmur did the year before with parts that weren't, you had Joe Berger, you had other guys there, but it wasn't a total remaking of that group. It was just a change of quarterback and some changes on the offensive line, and the whole thing fell apart. And you had Dalvin Cook back, and I know he couldn't stay healthy, but they just couldn't get any kind of mixture identity involved. They had an identity crisis from the middle of the season when they were 4-2-1. And so with Gary Kubiak coming in, having a full offseason, I view this as a situation where this is the best case scenario for them to get an offense established with a full time frame to do it. And you have to hope that you're not undercut like they were last year at times with Pat Elflein, Nick Easton injuries, that you're not undercut at that spot and undermined what you're able to do with your system. But I think leaning more on Dalvin Cook and whatever running back is going to back him up is going to help the pass protection and Kirk Cousins immensely.
Andrew Krammer from the Star Tribune here with us on Purple Daily for the hour. Bill Barnwell joins at 1:30. And then we have your buddy Chip Scoggins is in this afternoon.
I'm surprised he's not already here. He's 17 hours early to everything he does in life. It's impressive.
Always very early. Okay, I want to, just because you deserve this, give you some NFL Films music for this next part of the show. To run down some of the off-season, there was, yes, NFL Films music? There you go.
I was trying to find the right one.
It really, I mean, you have so many options. There's a wide, beautiful palette of NFL Films music.
I'm a perfectionist, Caller.
You are. So to run down some of these things on the checklist for the Vikings offseason, I want to just get your take on these. So I just wrote down a bunch of things that they have to decide on, and you can tell me sort of like quick hits style. Okay. Football.
Quick hits.
Thank you, Manny.
Whoa, I love that. That's new. We got a bunch of shiny objects around here now.
Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah,
I love it.
Whether to franchise tag Anthony Barr.
Yeah, absolutely not. He's not worth what would be a projected $15 million. I think he was overpaid last year at $12 million. Really, really good player, not a great player.
Put odds on him coming back. What percentage would you give that?
I would give it about 20%. I just don't think that the Vikings are going to be the highest bidder for Anthony Barr.
Sheldon Richardson. Re-signing Sheldon Richardson?
I think that will be a priority. This is just conjecture, but I think that will be a priority based on what Mike Zimmer likes in his defense and how Sheldon played at times last year.
We don't allow conjecture. Trey Wayans. Do they extend him or trade him?
Ooh.
What's more likely?
I think more likely is an extension. I think Trey really took a leap last year. He was one of the most targeted corners in 2017. Cut that in half last year because they found other places that were softer in the defense to throw. That is a credit to Trey and his improvement. I think they'll keep him at $9 million next year, and I think an extension is more likely than him getting traded.
If you have to pause to tackle something in the room, you can. Just like with the offensive line talk and the NFL Films music.
Oh, you want me to give the voice like the
I just mean if you just like want to tackle someone or like tackle Manny or just, flip this table.
I was actually wondering why the tackle dummy was in the corner of the room, but now I get it.
Extend Adam Thielen or rework his contract in some way so the man has more cash in his pockets.
I think that is likely. Rick Spielman said at the bye week last year that we have a track record of taking care of people who play well for us. That was when he was asked about Adam Thielen. I think you could see a similar deal to Stephon Diggs in Adam Thielen's pocket.
Moving on from Laquan Treadwell.
Ooh, now that would cost them, I believe, about $2.5 million. It's a lot to swallow, but Laquan has shown that he's very inconsistent at times. He can make some really just boneheaded mistakes that you don't want to see mental mistakes that far in his NFL career. So